had always found sign language just a beautiful and intricate language and was very interesting to me. With every new motion, a new story is about to unfold. So this year I finally decided to learn it from start to finish. In this class, they taught me so much beautiful and rich history about sign language and how it even came to be. In 1814 is when it really started to take off. Thomas Gallaudet, its creator, had moved to France to be taught. There he met Laurent Clerc, a French professor who taught deaf students. He had made a deal with Thomas and Laurent, so together they had created ASL by Laurent teaching him French Sign Language, which is mostly American Sign Language, and Thomas taught him English. Together they created ASL, American Sign Language, which was combined of mainly French signs, a couple of village signs from the surrounding islands, and a couple of home signs that Thomas had already learned. They moved back after 3 years of honing their skills in 1817 to open up the Gallaudet University. Many people at the time in the early 1800s who were deaf lived in rural isolated areas away from the busier population, mainly because people who were deaf were thought to be lesser and useless because of their disabilities. The ones with money, though, were forced to learn lip reading, which was very difficult, a time-consuming and hard thing to learn, and constant practice needed, which was very difficult for young kids. They had to rely on the vibrations of their throat to speak, which always sounded very confusing, and they had to mainly rely on body language and what would fit in the sentence to actually understand the lip reading. It wasn't as simple as just looking at their lips when they spoke. It was very difficult, and many people couldn't learn it that easily. It had to be taught from a very young age and constantly practice, and even then it wasn't working that well. But when Gallaudet and Laurent Clerc had showed up with American Sign Language, many people thought that was a new way. But it wasn't taken the way it should have been by the government. They said that it was a useless and meaningless gesture, and that it was not a real language, and if they were to open up their school, they weren't allowed to teach it. They were forced to teach lip reading instead, which they didn't like, and they constantly fought for sign language should be taken as a real language, but they still kept their school for the deaf. Without William Stoke, sign language would have probably never left the ground and wouldn't have became what it is today. He showed everybody that it was a real language and that it was more efficient, quicker, and easier to learn for everybody. Also, much easier for other people to even understand with the obvious signs. And with that, they were able to actually start the university, and sign language was able to take off. Today, ASL is the go-to language. Lip reading isn't very practiced anymore. Some people do practice it, but ASL is what they mainly learn first. Schools today are all over for the deaf, from pre-K to universities. You can even move in at the dorms there from a very young age at some schools. Some are just like today, mainly entering everyday schools, but there are hundreds of them around now. There are interpreters at every government official speech or event, which lets people understand. Interpreters are people who sign while the speech is being given, so it helps many people who are deaf and watching or hearing impaired. Closed captioning was even created for deaf people, so that way they can understand their TV shows and news. And there are a bunch of organizations for deaf people's rights, so that way they won't be treated lesser. Even the football huddle was created by deaf people. In a 1994 Gallaudet University against another opposing team game, one of the Gallaudet students had suspected the other had learned sign language, so that way they can cheat off their strategy. So they created a huddle, and the rest is history. Another really interesting about sign language is that Alexander Graham Bell was actually quite influential and active in the deaf community too, which is ironic since the phone and Alexander Graham Bell, obviously hearing communication, but nonetheless he was still very active and actually helped in the deaf community. As I said before, it's such an interesting and intricate, beautiful language. I encourage everybody to learn it too. Itself, but followed by its origin, history, and development is fascinating. To truly follow each step it took along history will probably take a while, but it is quite a fascinating language and very interesting to learn. Also, my by today, there's no shortage of signs